And it's really my pleasure to be joined today here with me. We've got Darren Wilson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of ore mining company LKAB. Hi, Darren. And we've got on the screen, we've got Thomas Hörnfeldt, who is Vice President of Sustainability and Public Affairs at steel manufacturing SSAB. Hello, Thomas. And we've got Andreas Regnell, who is Head of Strategic Development at Vattenfall, who is one of Europe's largest producer of electricity with almost 20,000 employees. So welcome to the panel. Can you hear us okay from where you are?
We can hear you excellently.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So I hope that was a helpful introduction. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then of course we're going to open to the floor and to the audience for more. I guess what really struck me reading into the HYBRIT project is how it's quite unique as it brings together actors from right across the steel value chain to work to decarbonize such a key material as steel. What were your organization's driver to get this project off the ground? And maybe I can start with Darren here.
Okay, well, I guess there's been a lot of talk, even this morning, about scope 1, 2, and 3, and I guess that points to the fact that there are very few industries that have total control of the full value chain. So if you want to truly get to zero CO2, you have to work in collaboration, which is where this three major player partnership came about.
And do you want to give you perspective, maybe Andreas on the screen?
Yeah, I think the fact that we need to change the whole value chain is a key reason. I think another one is to do this, and nowadays it comes across as the most obvious idea. It was for sure not 4 years ago, and I think there has something to do with guts, and it's much easier to have guts if you're 3 than if you're 1. So apart from the very logical part of it.
What were your drivers going into this partnership?
No, but I can only underline what my colleagues have been saying. I think also we have, if I may play the Swedish card, a tradition over here of working closely together across value chains and across industries. We're a small country, and we need to be able to work together in order to get an international outreach. SSAB and LKAB have been working together for many years in various development projects, and Vattenfall has been one of our most important suppliers for many, many years.
Thank you.
It was just a very natural step to take. The opposite, trying to keep this secret and create this change without telling anybody, wasn't just an option.
Thank you so much. And so I'm interested of what are the barriers and challenges to scale up the production of fossil-free steel, because are the challenges mainly on the supply side or on the demand side? And Darren, do you want to start on that?
Well, I suppose just to give some background, our core business is to mine iron ore in the Swedish Arctic Circle in Norrbotten. And this project is about, there are so many elements to it. We've had to look at extending reserves so that we have sufficient reserves to last for quite some time. The methods of mining, we're going deeper, 2 kilometers down, and to do that with zero CO2, but also using automation, all different kind of technologies to do that. And we're also investing heavily in, when you take the iron ore body out, you're traditionally left with lots of waste material, that we want to kind of use that for rare earth oxides and critical minerals for so many of the things that we've been talking about earlier today. So that, and then obviously with all of the hydrogen technology and the things that I'll leave some of our colleagues to talk about as well. As an investment, but also for innovation and new technology, it's been absolutely huge.
Thank you, Darren. And maybe Thomas, what are the challenges to scale up?
If you state the question like you did, was that on the demand side or the supply side?
Yep.
I think if you had asked me 4 years ago when we launched this in 2016, I would have said the demand side. How are we going to convince people that this is the right way to go? Today, I would say the supply side. It's really amazing how much the interest in materials in general, in embedded carbon, has increased in the last couple of years. And if we have this development continuing on the same pace for another 5 years to 2026, then we will be sold out very quickly.
That's good to hear. And then Andreas, from your side, what are the challenges of scaling up green hydrogen production?
think fossil-free hydrogen is again, we have a quite favorable position in the Nordic countries, and particularly in Sweden, given that first of all 98% of electricity production is already fossil-free, and we also have an excess of about 15 to 20 terawatt hours per year. Of course, with a few hybrids down the line, even with growth in production, that might come more in a balance, but we start from an excess of electricity, of fossil-free electricity. But if you take a more global perspective, or start with a European perspective, I think it's actually not the technology actually that is the biggest hurdle, nor is the demand, as we just heard, but it's actually the access to fossil-free or electricity that is. If I would rate the pace setter for this technology to be rolled out across the globe, it's actually it is really the access to fossil-free electricity, because there are many other industries that also need vast amount of fossil-free electricity, and the pace we're building out production capacity right now is just not there yet.
Thanks, Andreas. And actually, that leads me quite nicely to my next question: is what is the role of policymakers in driving this transition and kind of creating the right market conditions for fossil-free steel? Is government backing really important to kickstart the transition? And Darren, do you want to start?
Well, it's critical for a number of reasons, but if I could just take a step back, one of the big challenges we have is the perception of mining and steel making. And when we talk about sustainability, a lot of the narrative now is, well, we shouldn't be taking any resource out of the ground. But I think people have to reflect on everything around us has come out of the ground. And if you go out and if you look at any of the old technology or new technology, it comes out of the ground. We've been talking about wind farms, about solar. I'm sure Andreas will talk about the scale of the investment that has to be made to generate that level of hydrogen and all of the renewables. And so many of the minerals that you need for that, we don't have above the surface now. So if I can give one very quick anecdote, if you think of old technology like a steam train, that 60 years ago you may have made out of 10 to 20 different minerals. If you compare that to, say, an iPhone or a wind turbine, there are about 50 different minerals in there. I mean, there are things like rare earth elements, battery things that we've been talking about earlier. And even if we was to recycle everything we've got now, that's not enough for what we've got in the future. So I think that has to be part of the discussion on, although if you do the basic maths zero sum, we can't forever keep taking resource out of the ground. There's a sequence of things, and we have to go through a transition. We have to go through a transition where to make zero CO2 industry processes, electrify things, there still needs to be some use of resource, but in the most sustainable way. So we have to look at when we do mine or when we do extract, we do it in an efficient way. And so I think the government's supporting part of that message and getting that across. I guess the other challenge will be these things cost lots of money, and there is a cost to it at the end, which over time with technology that always comes down. But what happens when you've got zero CO2 steel that's competing with high CO2 steel that's coming in, and carbon borders and things? So, I mean, it's a big subject and it's a huge amount that governments can do. But I actually think that society, in just their awareness of the importance of this and the part that it plays in the overall decarbonisation, how important that is.
Thanks, Darren. Thomas, so the question was, what is the role of government and policymakers, and is it quite important at this initial phase of the transition?
I think we are talking about huge investments here, and I think that policymakers have a role to play here. I think it's important that we have appropriate guidelines, that we have transparency in declaring how green are materials actually. What is it that we are working on together? And there is certainly a role for the policymaker here. If I may just expand a bit on what Darren was saying earlier about utilizing resources in a responsible way, we should be aware of the fact that steel is by far the most circular material in the world. We recycle more steel every year than aluminum, plastic, glass, wood, paper, and so on combined. And what makes steel unique is that when you recycle it, when you melt down recycled scrap to make new steel, you really break the material down to atomic level, and you create a virgin material also from recycled content. From that point of view, steel is really the world's most circular material. But steel is also a very long-lived material, and the use of steel in the world increases. Since we have a growing world population, we have an increased standard of living in the world. The world is slowly becoming a better place, let's not forget that. And we have a growing urbanization in the world, and all of this drives steel consumption. So even though the recycling rate is above 90% for the foreseeable future, we need to be able to make steel not only from recycled content, but from iron ore as well. And that is exactly what we're doing within this HYBRIT initiative. And we should also remember that we're not talking about science fiction here. We have, the three of us together, already produced the first fossil-free steel. The first plates roll of fossil-free content was delivered to the Volvo Group about a month ago. So this is something that we're doing, still in small scale, but we're doing it here and now.
Thank you, Thomas. And Andreas, so on the role of government and policymakers, is that kind of like already passed for renewable energy, in the sense that the economics of renewable energy already stack up and you don't need government backing, or do you still need that policymakers and government support?
I think that maybe, I mean, the economic backing is less central today than it was a few years ago. However, just to get the volumes built that we need a lot of permissions, we need a lot of, so enabling the volume is an important role for the governments when it comes to permissions, plans for the future, even though it might not be needed for vast subsidizations. And then we come to another chapter, which is with all this renewable power, you need flexibility, and the flexibility might then be the ones that you need to subsidize a bit to get that market going as well. But if we just look at the renewables build out, I think it's more enabling the build out than paying for the build out, if you see what I mean.
Thanks, Andreas. And my very last question before I take questions from the floor is, and I guess that's my social sciences background coming here, is I'm just interested of like, what have you learned from working in this close, collaborative way? Very different company, right? Different company cultures, different people. And also as a learnings from your journey, which could benefit other hard to decarbonize sectors. And Darren, do you want to start maybe?
Well, I think something around the scale of the change. I mean, if you stop and think the technology that's having to be developed, the scaling up of power generation that per annum is about 2.5 times the demand of Denmark, that takes time. And I think as a society, we can all look back and think we haven't done enough, we haven't done it soon enough, we haven't done it fast enough, but that's gone now. And I think the realization that all industries have to really look hard at what has to happen. And I think for big industries like cement's going through the same thing, glass manufacture, it may take 10 years of innovation to really make an impact thereafter. So when it comes to all of the prioritization of different things on sustainability, I think elimination of greenhouse gases is the first one. But it's a big challenge, and it has to start with the first steps. And I think at the point that Thomas made, I mean, it was a huge achievement a month ago to actually make the first 100 tons of fossil-free steel. Thanks,
Darren. And Thomas, do you want to come in on this idea of this collaboration between different elements of the value chain? And, is there been lessons learned, or what was the benefits of that?
As I said earlier, I think we have an old tradition of actually doing things together. I think the important thing is to have a common vision, a clear picture of where you want to go, and then really trust each other and go for it. To have the tone from the top in the respective companies is an important part of that.
Thank you so much. Andreas, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I would underline the last comment, Thomas, that you need to have because working three organizations is incredibly powerful, because you bring together 3 times 1 is actually more than 3 in many dimensions, but at the same time you have 3 wills, and that makes things slightly more complicated sometimes, and to overcome that part, it's very important that it's coming truly from the top, so that you have the CEOs talking to each other, so we can overcome these different perspectives on things to be fast enough. So on the one hand, it's a prerequisite. On the other hand, you need to just make sure that it's linked at the top. But then it's incredibly powerful.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andreas. Okay, so I'm going to take questions from the floor. The light is quite strong, so I might do like this to try to spot. Has anybody got questions? Oh yeah, like there's questions there.
Hello, it's Craig Hales here from Skanska. You talk a lot about the collaboration between your organisations and the difficulty in getting green hydrogen to make the fossil-free steel. I wonder what your thoughts were about the part that you could play to sort of accelerate the production of green hydrogen in the UK.
Question for Andreas, maybe?
I must admit that my knowledge about the UK market is not good enough to know exactly what's going on and what would be needed to do more. But I think in general terms, I think we primarily active on the offshore side, and I think that the targets that have been set for UK offshore has been raised quite a lot, and I think in the end it's about making that speed actually happen, because that's the only way to get any room for green hydrogen.
Thanks. Have we got any other question? Yeah, like gentleman in the back.
I applaud all of these marvellous efforts and the attempts to coordinate, but there's one big question to which I don't think there is a clear answer. How do we get China, India and the US on board?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because how can fossil-free steel compete with cheap imports from countries such as China? And do you want to start, Darren, maybe on that?
I don't know, I mean, we do a lot of business in China through different parts of the minerals business after, and there's a huge amount of innovation in China. I mean, because overall China is emitting still huge amounts of CO2, it kind of perhaps doesn't mask the fact that from a sustainable point of view, there's a lot that is going on. But I think that comes back to the policy making earlier and carbon borders. So when we successfully produce much higher volumes of zero CO2 steel or fossil-free steel, what happens then from a competitive point of view if there's cheaper steel being dumped that's high in CO2? So I think that is where, well, that's where the diplomats and people that are outside of this room and maybe in Washington at the moment, in Glasgow in November, need to do that through global coordination.
I also think that it's important that this cheap Chinese imports is not relevant for the first parts of when we get the hybrid going and some other competing efforts potentially, that piece of the market is just a few percentages of the total market. And as Thomas indicated, the demand will by far exceed the supply for quite some time. So this cheap China imports is not a question for but as volumes grow and we've got to, it's a big chunk of output, then it could potentially be a threat. However, I think that the customer, given that we get what Thomas asked for, a clear declaration and transparency on the fossil content of all products, I think that we, as kind of high-end producers, I think that the having a low carbon content or zero carbon content would be incredibly competitive. So I'm actually less worried about that until we get to really large volumes. Then it could be a threat.
Thanks, Andreas. I think it's worth noting that China is showing quite a lot of leadership now and net zero, and has set quite ambitious carbon neutrality targets, so watch this space. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Oh. Not yet. So maybe in the meantime, while you think about your next question, I've got some spare ones. I think one question for me was, will there be adaptations needed to adopt fossil-free steel on the consumer side? So for instance, people like Scania, can they buy that steel and effectively it does exactly the same thing? Or is the product different?
Well, I think that's one for Thomas, but I think it's...
Thomas?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. We are talking a lot about fossil-free steel here, But what we're actually changing is the iron making part of the process. Instead of using a blast furnace and carbon and coke to turn iron ore into iron, we're using hydrogen to turn iron ore into iron. But once we have iron, the downstream processes that we have in the steel industry, where we fix the alloying content, the chemical composition, the dimensions, the heat treatment, all the steps where we actually create the properties of the steel, they will be the same as they are today. And that also means that our steels in the future will have at least the same properties and performance that they have today. So that when we start introducing fossil-free steel to the market as a commercial product in 2026, we will be able to make fossil-free versions of the steels that we have today, so that our customers can seamlessly switch from, let's call it a classic steel, to a fossil-free version with exactly the same composition and performance.
That's fantastic. So sustainability, but without compromise. Has anybody come up with? Oh, yeah, the gentleman there has got a question.
Just thinking about, it's Simon Hicks from Crosswind Partners, but just thinking about other construction materials, concrete, glasses, ceramics, they all require a lot of heating and utilize a lot of fossil fuels in the making, and ergo produce a lot of carbon emissions. And I was wondering if there's any overlap between, some of the technologies or processes which you're pioneering, particularly around hydrogen heating, that can be duplicated in other industries or in other construction materials?
That's a great question. Who wants to take this one?
I can make it real quick. The big change that we do, like I said, is in our own iron making process. So that change, that improvement is intrinsic to the steel industry as such. But maybe Andreas has some thoughts about whether the fact that we are going to increase the world production of green hydrogen by thousands of percent could have spillover effects in other areas as well.
Yeah, I think, and I would really talk about the heating piece that I think was mentioned, that it's just very much more efficient to heat directly with electricity rather than going first to make hydrogen, then burn the hydrogen to get the heat. So I think there's a large benefit and there is a lot of research going on to use electricity as the input for heating. And I think that the current level of scale heating is somewhere just north of 1,000 degrees. But if you can scale that, have scale heating for 1,200 degrees or 1,300 degrees or 1,400 degrees, you start covering most of the processes that you use fossil fuels for heating today. So the technology development in terms of using electricity as the direct source, direct energy for heating, is incredibly important for cement, for example, because the second step in cement manufacturing, you need, if I remember correctly, up to 1,300 degrees or even more. So that's difficult today to do with electricity, and we have made some trials, but not on a scale. So that's clearly an area that, so there is an overlap, because we do of course heat the gas in our process, but we don't need to go up to those temperatures. But electrical heating is a key development area to do efficient decarbonization of society.
Thank you, Andreas. And Darren, you wanted to say?
Well, really reinforcing. I think hydrogen is a huge part of the solution. It gives flexibility. It may be what heats our homes with boilers. As Andreas says, there's lots of industrial processes that it lends itself. And there are big overlaps between other industries. But within construction, we mentioned cement there, maybe carbon capture, but many things like quicklime actually release CO2 as part of the kind of process of conversion. So there has to be new zero CO2 cementitious materials, and there's a lot of work that's going on with that. It's important to us too, because we actually consume around 150,000 tonnes of cement in our mining operations. So that's part of the journey to zero, in the same way that when you're building something with concrete, you've got the steel reinforcement. So there's an absolute connection. And that's what, when we talked about earlier, not only the collaboration between these three partners, but I think just all of industry and the way that it all fits and works together, whether it's the way you transport it, the way you produce things upstream and downstream.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we can't look in isolation. We need to look at the whole supply. I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much, Darren, Andreas, Thomas, like really fascinating. If the audience want to join me, like thanking them, like thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, and the panel. What a change fossil-free steel can actually make. Fingers crossed on a successful roller. I saw something in the social media about a month ago of the first piece of steel. It's a lot more steel to be made, but fingers crossed.